Hi everybody. This is our second video for chapter 16, and in this video we're going to talk about the Beveridge curve. And the Beveridge curve might feel a little bit sort of off topic in this chapter, right? This chapter we're talking about sort of the relationship between technological growth, which we know is sort of the source of long run growth in GDP per capita, the long run source of increases in our standards of living, and the unemployment rate, right? Because there's always a concern that the adoption of new technology, new capital will lead to higher unemployment rates and people losing their job. But what we want to show here with the Beveridge curve is the relationship between firms hiring and the unemployment rate. And what we'll see is that when the unemployment rate is low, that's when firms tend to be hiring, and when the unemployment rate is high, firms tend not to be hiring. We get the cyclical relationship. And so let's get started here. So basically what the Beveridge curve is saying, and it's a Beveridge named after someone named Beveridge rather than like a drink. Job creation is strongly pro-cyclical. What pro-cyclical means is that it goes up during booms, during expansions, and then falls during recessions or contractions. And job destruction is very counter-cyclical. And so this is important because, if we saw that, higher, faster growth and adoption of technology led to more jobs being destroyed, then we would expect to get the opposite relationship. And so the Beveridge curve shows this relationship between the unemployment rate and the job vacancy rate. The vacancy rate is just the number of job vacancies divided by total employment. And so you can see we've plotted two different Beveridge curves in this graph. We have the unemployment rate here on the horizontal axis and the vacancy rate on the vertical axis. And you can see that they have similar shapes, right? So they are both downward sloping. The bottom one here is for Germany. And you can see we often connect the Beveridge curves rather than just show them as a scatter plot. And so this is 2001. They had a recession, and then as the expansion went up, they came up this way into 2015. You can see they had only a sort of small change in the unemployment rate during the financial crisis compared to the United States. So the United States starts up here and, goes back and forth a little bit along this sort of Beveridge curve, and then the financial crisis hits the United States particularly hard. And so we end up all the way over here with an unemployment rate of about 10%. And then when we come back, we actually have a higher vacancy rate for sort of a given unemployment rate. And that's something that we have to think about in the data. I think that might be related to, the internet and online jobs being easier to post. But the relationship stays the same. The interesting thing is that the United States has shifted up compared to Germany, right? And so I think one of the things that we're going to sort of conclude in this chapter is that labor market institutions end up being very important in terms of how economies respond to both, recessions and expansions, but also to sort of adoptions of new technology. So here is sort of another example that adds, this is for the United States, it adds in the pandemic. And so the pandemic ended up shifting our Beveridge curve up even more, right? So this is the data we had before, the sort of red and yellow, and then the gray is the post-financial crisis. But then we get this big shift out from the pandemic. And then as we recover from the pandemic, we end up, with very low unemployment rates, but much higher job vacancy rates. Although now we are coming back to sort of where we were after the financial crisis. But it's very interesting that the number of job vacancies spiked so high. And the question, I don't know if we have a great answer to why that is yet. So now one of the things that's important to note in the labor market is that the labor market is one that takes a long time to clear. It takes a long time for workers to find employers and employers to find workers. We might not have a good match between the unemployed workers and what firms are hiring for, either because of the skills required or because of the location, right? We might have either, workers that have different skills in Boston compared to what Boston firms want to hire. Or we could have workers that have the exact skills that those Boston firms want to hire, but they're in, Kansas. And so it's going to take a while to find them. And so that means that, we could potentially improve efficiency with new policies and technology. And certainly, as the labor market has moved online, you could argue that maybe that would improve things. Although I think some of the headlines we're seeing these days is that, it's so easy to both post jobs and apply for jobs that you end up with so many applications that it's very difficult to sort of sort through all of those and find the best match. And then, of course, we can get different shocks, right? We can get different regional shocks or industry-specific shocks that make it difficult for workers to find jobs for which they are well suited. And so, coming back to the U.S. and German Beveridge curves, right? The German Beveridge curve may have shifted sort of closer to the origin, shifted down a little bit because they made some labor market changes around this time period that made it easier for unemployed workers to find jobs. Whereas the U.S. curve shifted up, right? That's what we talked about. Whether or not that's due to the supply side or the demand side of this labor market is a little unclear, right? It could be a skill-based mismatch. One thing that we have seen is that workers are less likely to move than they used to be in the United States, but it could also just be that firms found it so much easier to post jobs in an online environment that shifted up the vacancy rate. The other question then is, all right, well, what about people who are unemployed for a long time, right? So in equilibrium, on average, people are unemployed in the United States for only 2 to 3 months usually. And that means that, being unemployed is terrible in general, but if you can find a job in 2 to 3 months, it's not terrible. But then you end up with people who are unemployed for 4, 5, 6 months, even a year or longer. And that long run unemployment can be very painful. And so we can think about sort of those policies that either create incentives to work, right? That would move our wage setting curve. And we can also think about sort of investment incentives for firms to increase the number of workers that they hire because they want to produce more. And that would be more related to our price setting curve. And so our long run equilibrium is obviously where our price setting and wage setting curves cross. And we can also think of that as sort of where the number of firms are constant. Now, that said, the long run equilibrium is never a place where we really get to, right? It's always sort of a place where we're moving. But because we're constantly introducing new technologies, new capital, some firms are going out of business, some firms are starting, we're never really sort of at that long run equilibrium. But what we can think about is the relationship between sort of markups and firm entry and exit, right? And so whenever we think about firm entry and exit, we think about, well, how profitable are firms? If firms are more profitable, then that's going to attract new firms, right? So when there's a higher markup, we will end up with more firms entering. And when there's a lower markup, when profits are smaller, then we would expect more firms to exit. And so that's really just what this graph is showing, right? We've got the markup on our vertical axis and the number of firms on our horizontal axis. And basically, this is just saying that, we'll end up with fewer firms when we have a higher markup, and more firms when we have a lower markup, as for more firms exist, right? We have that sort of profit maximizing markup. And so the equilibrium then is that where we have that equilibrium number of firms. And so when we get a higher markup, then we end up pushing our price setting curve down, and we end up with more firms. So we can think about this in terms of our long run price setting curve, right? Where, our real wage here, W, is equal to lambda, productivity, and our equilibrium profits, or markup, mu star. And so the real wage is equal to how much workers produce times 1 minus the markup. And we can think about how much that will, result in changes in the real wage, right? And so that means that, the price setting curve is going to shift up when technology improves. It also will shift down when there's higher tax rates. It will shift up when there's more competition. It will shift down when there's more risk of appropriation. But all of these things, right, are going to shift our long run price setting curve. And so we can use that now as we move forward in the next videos to think about, all right, well, how does this adoption of new technology affect the number of firms and the number of workers in the long run?